Hello, my name is Jacob Keffer, and welcome to my video on my software engineering independent project. For this project, I chose the topic of collision in 2D space, and essentially all that is whenever two objects interact with each other or they connect, they end up reacting in their own way once those two objects connect. And essentially, what I did was I created 4 different objects in this space, as I'll explain in further detail here in a few minutes. And basically all these objects just interact with each other in this space, and each certain object reacts in their own way. And just a quick overview of all of my objects. I have a rectangle, a circle, a triangle, and of course the player, which will actually have movement itself and will react to these objects. And as you can see right here on this side over here, all these objects use a collider, a rigid body, and a script, so that way it can control, or basically within the code it will react in its own way within there. Now onto basically my first object, which is the player itself. And essentially this is the one where you control with movement keys, as you can see on the script right here. These are essentially the different key codes that I've put in here. And basically I use WASD in order to move this character, as I will demonstrate right now while I run the game. As you can see, he's moving. In a few minutes I'll get to the ball, as you can also see it's moving. And for right now, let's just move over to the script and see how the player moves. And essentially all I did was I used a JavaScript in order to actually code out the different interactions and the collision detection for all these objects. And what I did here is I used key code variables in order to gain and store the different types of movements, which is, like I said, WASD. And I used just essentially all these if statements in order. Whenever you press a certain key, it reacts. For instance, you press W here, he moves up, and if you press S, he moves down, and then so forth and so on. And then basically if you're not moving or not pressing a key, it's essentially velocity 0 on both. Now moving on to more of the main part of my project, the collision between these two objects, I will focus on first the ball object, which was the very first one I made and started to use to interact with all the other objects. And essentially, as we look right here in the script itself, you can see that I have this on collision into 2D, and that's really one of the main focuses I have for this project, because this function essentially is used for whenever an object interacts or basically hits it, it will call this function, and then it will basically do what it needs to do in order to react. Now, one of the things I found out in Unity is that a lot of the collision itself is done and dealt with whenever you have a collider and a rigid 2D body. And it really makes it very simple, so in order to really try to demonstrate more collision, I decided to basically give this ball a different type of velocity when it interacts with items. And first I'll demonstrate that on how it hits the ship. Now as you can see, whenever it hits the ship, you can see that it transfers momentum, or it slows down when an object is not moving. And then now I'll explain that in the code right here. And essentially what this function is doing is it's taking in collider info, and then it's going to use this tag right here. And all these objects have tags, as you can see right up here. I made individual tags for each of these 4 different objects, so that way they can all interact with each other and they can basically use that function. And then once they do that, or they have the appropriate tag, in here, these lines of code essentially mean basically whenever this ball interacts with other items, and usually whenever items collide, they usually lose velocity, or they can also even gain velocity as well if an object's moving in a certain way, or if it collides in a different way. And essentially that's all this code is doing right here, is that basically get just 3/4 of a velocity and then get a third of it so that way it can transfer motions. And basically, like I said before, if there's 0 velocity on the item that it's hitting, it's going to slow down and eventually just get to the point where it's going to stop moving. Alright, now moving on to the next object that I created that helps interact in this 2D space is a triangle. And basically what this triangle does is, I will first demonstrate the actual interaction between the items. Basically, whenever the ball hits it, it basically has a spinning motion, which certain objects, you know, basically in our reality, it actually collides and hits, and then certain items tend to spin. Now, as for the actual code itself, I essentially created these values right here for speed, tilted angle, timer, the time, and stop timer. So that way, once the ball hits it on the collision, as you can see right here with the tag ball, it's going to send true to a timer, and then if it is true, it will update the timer, and basically around the 5-second mark, as you can see on stop time, it's going to stop doing the rotation as you saw. And basically what this line of code here is doing is that it's saying take the actual rotation of the object right now, set it equal to this quaternion.slurp, which is basically a function that just rotates an object from its current position to the one that you want it to tilt to on the z-axis, so that way we get this steering wheel effect that you saw. And then we move it based on the time delta and the speed, so it's going to move this at this rate right here, so that way it gives it like a smooth movement as you saw. And then I'll just demonstrate it again just so you can see that it moves really smoothly whenever the ball hits, decides to hit. And there it is, you see? And then you'll notice that it will eventually stop around there. And then next, the item I'm going to move on next is pretty much my final collision item, which is basically the rectangle. And you probably kind of already saw it already, but I'll go ahead and actually just go ahead and demonstrate it again, so that way you can see what's happening whenever the ball or a triangle react to it. There it goes. It basically I gave it a gravity effect, and then I gave it a spinning wheel effect that it keeps moving until it hits this wall and stop. And now I will explain it in the actual script itself. Okay. Now here's the actual, pretty much my last object in this 3D space, and then it basically uses kind of the same format to rotate as you saw in the triangle. It uses the on collision like all the other ones use, and basically what this whole function is doing right here is it's getting the tag, and once it collides with the ball of the triangle, I'm going to give it gravity, and then I'm going to set it true, because in update that's where it's going to actually do the rotations, and then it's going to basically rotate it in the way of clockwise. So that way it gives it that motion that it's actually moving like a wheel. And then once it basically collides with the bottom border, as you can see here, that's when I start giving it that velocity movement of when it's spinning. It's basically just taking it half of the velocity that it originally has and then just moving it. And then essentially the last thing is, if the collider info.collider tag equals for the right side border, it's basically just going to stop that movement in that rotation. Okay, and then the last thing that I did wanted to look at was actually the borders of this game. It's the only script I haven't really looked into right now. But yeah, actually, I'll go ahead and show the script first. Alright, and essentially in this script, what it's doing is just making collider boxes around all the 4 different sides of the camera itself. It's actually making the appropriate size for it, and then it's going to center it based on that position, And then we just do that using vectors, so that way we can get just a simple, like a 2D box. That's all the reason why we're doing that. And then I will basically show you how it looks whenever it's being rendered. We basically just go back to scene, we just click on the game scene, and then you can see all the boxes that all these objects are basically being contained in within this 2D space. Now, I mean, that's pretty much all that this independent project was about, was just the different collisions and what you can do with collisions with it. And overall, this was my first time using Unity, and I found it fairly easy and very enjoyable. Pretty much a lot better than using like an IDE like Visual Studio, because it's just simply snapping in certain components and then just adding in simple scripts, so that way you can control and do then there's just certain features with certain items. Alright, thank you for watching.